On this episode of Doing the Most, nearly 1 year in the making, our recipe for Dandelion Mead.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
Now, you could make this recipe as a wine, like a country fruit wine, using sugar. However, in the spirit of doing the most, especially with how much work this brew takes, we felt like doing the most was using honey and turning it into a mead. It makes it extra rich, extra summery, and just super delicious. When harvesting dandelions, you're gonna wanna shove those into a 1-gallon freezer bag and just shove them in there. Pile them on, get them in the freezer. What we would do is actually fill a 1-quart container with dandelion heads, then go throw that into the existing freezer bag until that freezer bag filled up day after day. If doing a full 5-gallon batch, this takes a lot of dandelion plucking, so make use of your freezer. And every day when you finish plucking your dandelion heads, roll that section of the bag up tight. I say this because we found that it was easiest to pluck all of our dandelion petals from the dandelion heads in session after session, day after day. And of course, you want to make sure that you're plucking dandelion heads that haven't been sprayed with pesticides or herbicides or exposed to animal waste, those sorts of things. Keep an eye on your surroundings while plucking your dandelions.
The ingredients for our dandelion mead are 2.5 pounds of dandelion petals, 2 lemons worth of zest, 1 mandarin orange worth of zest, 12 ounces of raisins, 9.5 pounds of honey, and 5 full gallons of water. We're using D47 yeast. In secondary, after stabilizing, we're going to balance and back sweeten with 2 grams of citric acid and 2 pounds of honey. Making a dandelion mead or dandelion wine naturally comes with a little time outdoors. We harvested every single dandelion for this brew from our little backyard. And this took several weeks. Essentially, we picked dandelions throughout the entire dandelion growing season. And as we would collect them, we would fill up gallon freezer bags and put them in the freezer. Once we had collected 4-gallon bags packed to the brim with dandelion heads, we got to work plucking.
Now for this part, wear gloves, believe me. Otherwise you'll end up with a green thumb and a green forefinger.
Now, some say there's a technique where you can actually pluck the petals right off the fresh dandelion. I tried this a bunch and could not figure it out, so we chose to freeze ours, and then later, as we were getting ready to brew, spend the time separating the greens from the petals. You don't want any greens at all in here if you can at all avoid it. The greens are bitter and grassy, and they will add a terrible off flavor to your dandelion mead. We plucked and plucked and plucked, and this took several nights. But eventually we had almost right at 2.5 pounds of dandelion petals. And then I scooped out some orange blossom honey into our primary bucket. We actually mixed this one up live on one of our YouTube live streams, so the footage here is from that evening. We added our still frozen dandelion petals. As you can see, they filled up basically a whole gallon freezer bag, and then added some room temperature water to start thawing them out. I used a mash paddle to try and chop them up as best I could until the petals started to separate. And then we added a little bit more water. Stir, stir, stir. And then we added in our raisins.
Now I know what you're thinking, but yes, we did use raisins in this, but not for nutrient. We used raisins for body, and that's because we wanted to, at least in part, adhere to some of the Depression era and earlier practices where raisins and other sorts of dried fruits were used in dandelion wine. I was always prepared to amend the body and tannin profile on this, but it ended up I didn't need to.
Stir, stir, stir. And this is the kind of entertainment you've come to expect from our live streams. Time to get out our zester and zest our citrus fruit. I love this zester. It's super cool, has a couple of neat features, and I'll put a link to this zester in the description of this video. As you can see, we are zesting this directly into the primary bucket. Some of the old school recipes call for nearly whole citrus fruits in primary. I'm not here for that. I didn't want any flavors that would overpower the dandelion flavor. I only wanted to complement it.
Now some older recipes call for whole fruits, or lots of fruit juices, or even boiling fruit pulp and fruit skins. We don't really recommend that. We wanted the dandelion flavor to really shine here, so we used a little bit of zest, a little bit of acid amendment, but we wanted the citrus flavors to kind of provide a little bit of backbone for the dandelion and not take over the brew. Now you may differ in this department. You may come across a Depression era or earlier recipe that tickles your fancy, or you might take a look at the Jack Keller recipes. There are lots of different ways you can do this. We just really wanted to highlight the dandelion in this brew. I did have some fun playing on the inspiration of those old recipes by using dried fruit in this application. However, if you don't want to use raisins, I would think that 3-4 grams of red wine tannin would be sufficient.
And then we top it up with more water. I took a gravity reading and realized that I had slightly undershot my gravity, so I had to add a little bit more honey the next day to hit my target gravity.
Some old recipes actually call for heating the must to pasteurize it, and that's heating it with the dandelion petals in there. We didn't want to do that. We didn't want to apply any heat and risk breaking down any of those delicate flavors or aromas in those dandelion petals, so we did choose to use Campden tablets to shock our must.
And then we let that sit for 24 hours for the Campden to do its work. The next day I added the rest of the honey I would need to get this up to target gravity and took another gravity reading. We started out here at 1.061. Once it had been 24 hours since the Campden tablets went in, I pitched my yeast. And we're using 2 packs of D47 yeast in this. D47 I know is a little controversial, but it's one of my favorite yeasts.
Because of just how labor intensive building this dandelion mead was, we didn't want to cut any corners. So to start with a really high cell count, we pitched 2 packets of yeast.
Then we put our upturned mug on there and let it ride. Since raisins are not an adequate nutrient for mead, we used a TOSNA 2.0 nutrient schedule on this. I'll put a link in the description for more information on nutrient schedules, but basically what this means is we're going to add staggered additions of nutrients for our yeast. Here I'm using Fermentation, which provides the necessary nitrogen that the yeast need, as well as some essential vitamins and minerals that the yeast will use during fermentation. It's kind of like giving your yeast a balanced diet. We made those additions a few times using a TOSNA calculator, as well as punching our cap every single day to make sure that the dandelion petals and raisins stay wet. We don't want them to dry out and create an environment that would be conducive to mold growth. Once that finished primary fermentation, we were ready to get it racked off. I started by using a sanitized slotted spoon and a strainer to strain and press the dandelion petals, and then I racked it off as usual.
As you probably noticed, we started with a little bit higher yield than what would fit in our carboy when we racked it off. That's because I knew that the bulk age on this was going to be a while, and I didn't want any risk of oxidization in this because it's a delicate brew, it's a low alcohol brew, and so much darn work went into this, I didn't want any risk of it getting spoiled. Now, as this was clearing, I was tasting it regularly and trying to decide if I could get away with not back sweetening it. But over time, it was very clear that the common wisdom of adding some back sweetening sugars is important. Without that background layer of sweetness, it just tastes floral. Adding the sugar provides that seemingly missing element that rounds out the flavor profile.
And since I wanted to back sweeten with honey, I stabilized with potassium metabisulfite and potassium sorbate by package instructions in order to prevent re-fermentation, since we will be using a fermentable sugar to back sweeten. Then the day came to get this sweetened up. So we measured out our 2 pounds of honey and got it into the carboy. This is going to sweeten it up to a gravity of 1.010. I found that this was just the right amount of sweetness to provide some backbone for the floral flavors that are in this brew. This had plenty of tannin and sweetness at this point, but needed just a little pop of brightness to reinforce those citrusy, zesty flavors. So we added 2 grams of citric acid. It's a very small amount of acid.
Now we could have taken inspiration from those old recipes by using citrus juice, maybe orange juice and lemon juice. That's pretty common in those old recipes. But because of the level of control and fine tuning that we wanted, we decided to go with citric acid. I think tartaric acid might be a good acid amendment too, but I really want a pop of freshness in there that mimicked what you would get with citrus fruit. So citric acid it was.
And then of course, once that was clear, we bottled away. I opted to use a variety of different sizes of bottles because I knew this wasn't going to be a drink for everyone, and I also knew it would be difficult for one person or two people even to finish a whole bottle of this in one sitting. So those 750 milliliter bottles are for sharing. And there you have it, nearly a year in the making, Dandelion Mead.
Developing a Dandelion Mead recipe is not easy. You get basically one shot a year at getting it right. So while this worked out, and I feel like it was relatively simple and we made really good notes along the way, I just want to put a "your mileage may vary" disclaimer in there. They say you know you did it right if it looks like sunshine in the glass. So I think we nailed it. The aroma, the bouquet on it is like literally that. It's a bouquet. It smells like fresh flowers. Like when you walk into a flower shop and you're just hit with all of those floral aromatics from all the different kinds of flowers around you. It smells like sticking your face directly into a flower arrangement. There's no alcoholic booziness on the nose, and you really can't pick up on the sweetness on the nose either. It's a very subtle aroma. Let's dive in. The first snap of flavor you get there is just lightly citrusy. And then the honey comes through, and then you taste a little bit of that flower petal or like just lightly grassy flavor. It's got a great zing to it. On the exhale, it's all flower petals, but not in like an offensive way. But it's so hard to describe. It's not like you're eating flowers. It's like you're tasting how a bouquet of flowers smells. But with that layer of zestiness and that mead richness that the honey gives you, the whole thing kind of just comes together as its own tight little bundle of flavor. David was over the other day and I gave him a glass of this Dandelion Mead and he nailed the flavor profile perfectly. He said, "This tastes like honeysuckles, and now when I drink it, I can't get that out of my mind." It really does taste like you just plucked a fresh honeysuckle and slurped the nectar out of it. I will say, I don't think this is a drink for everyone. And if you don't like flowery things or like really any perfuminess at all, you're probably not gonna like this. But if you've got a more adventurous palate and you are willing to experiment with a pretty unusual ingredient by today's terms, I'd go for it. I like this brew a lot. I'm very happy with how this turned out. And there's not a whole lot that I would change on it next time, other than maybe subbing in powdered wine tannin instead of those raisins. Overall, I would definitely consider this a winner. I'm glad I have a ton of bottles of it because I don't know if I've got the energy to make it again this year. But I'm definitely curious about your thoughts on this recipe if you choose to brew it. So please, if you're gonna brew it, or if you do brew it, leave a comment and let me know what you thought. You can follow us on Instagram and Pinterest at doingthemostok. Our website's doingthemost.org, and we're on Twitch at doingthemostok. We also have a Discord server at discord.doingthemost.org. If you like this video, please hit subscribe and ring that bell for more content like this. And a big shout out to our members and patrons. Y'all make this channel possible, and we appreciate you. Until next time, cheers. Spring's coming. Get ready to pluck some dandelions.